Good morning, everyone. It's about 10 a.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. I'd like to welcome you to the Master Gardener Volunteer webinar. It's a special webinar today, not our normal last Thursday of the month webinar. And we are so glad that you can be here to learn a little bit more about monarchs, milkweed, and OE here in Florida. Our presenter today is Dr. Jaret Daniels. He is the curator and program director for the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity. The McGuire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity represents the largest collections-based research and education center in the world focused on butterflies and moths. So this is housed in Gainesville, Florida, on the campus of the University of Florida, and it is part of the Museum of Natural History. So if you have not had an opportunity to visit this beautiful center, I would encourage you to do so. So Dr. Jaret Daniels has a lot of amazing research that's been going on. He really focuses on insect ecology, population dynamics, and conservation. He looks into integrated crop pollination, also road ecology, and imperiled species recovery. And you can see his current research on this slide, kind of focusing on a number of federally endangered butterflies in Florida, including the Strauss swallowtail, the Attila butterfly or the Attila hairstreak, and the federally endangered Miami blue butterfly. And so these are some of the insects that he's been working on over the last decade plus. And he is a real renowned expert in Lepidoptera. He has written over or co-authored over 100 research papers on butterflies and moths. And he also has written more than a dozen butterfly and wildflower books encompassing the whole U.S. as far as his area of expertise. So we are always welcoming Dr. Jaret Daniels to our fields and our talks. He's a wonderful presenter for the Master Gardener Volunteers and a big supporter of citizen science, which is a lot of what we do. Today, we're going to be talking about milkweeds, our non-native milkweed that we grow a lot of here in Florida, our native milkweeds, and this very charismatic butterfly that we love so much, which is the monarch. And this is a wonderful picture from the Museum of Natural History there of the monarchs in Michoacan, Mexico, where there is their overwintering site. So I just love that photo. So Dr. Daniels, I'm going to go ahead and invite you to share your screen. I'm going to stop share at this time. And for those of you, I want you to know that we will be taking questions and answers in the Q&A box, so feel free to use that. And we will get started with the webinar right now. So welcome, Dr. Daniels.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks to all of you for having me this morning. Hopefully you can all hear me and see my presentation. It's great to always work with Master Gardeners. I really want to give all of you a huge round of applause for all the wonderful work you do throughout the state for so many different aspects of research and for the general public. So thank you so much for what you do on a daily basis for the visitors and citizens of Florida. And so today, as Wendy mentioned, we're going to be delving in a little bit more detail to kind of the overall situation of milkweed monarchs and the protozoan parasite OE in Florida. And the title, "It's Complicated," is meant there for a reason, because it is complicated, and we'll go into some of the details on that. But before we jump into those particulars, I want to just give a little bit of overview about the migration, the monarch, the organism that we really hold dear. As Wendy mentioned, it is arguably one of the most iconic and beloved insects in North America. It spans the continent, and it's most well known, at least the eastern population, for its multi-generational annual migration, which is, clearly one of the most spectacular natural phenomenon on the planet. If you haven't been to see the overwintering grounds in Mexico, I strongly encourage you to make that trip. It is really the only place to be essentially in a monarch snow globe surrounded by millions and millions of monarchs. You can hear the wing beats, the stream of monarchs, and the activity doesn't really let up through the course of the day. It's very dynamic and very inspirational and quite emotional to encounter. And so a lot of why we enjoy the Monarch, in addition between it's because the fact that it's large and showy, it's pretty ubiquitous in a lot of landscapes, is because of this large migration, which is such a unique phenomenon among insects overall. But it is at its core a butterfly of open habitats in proximity to larval host plants. Um, it's highly adaptable to urbanized settings, as you all know, and that's one of the challenges with the topic today, is because we are dealing with the green industry and the proliferation of non-native milkweed, expanding areas within urban and suburban cores. There are, additional stressors on this butterfly, which we do have to be aware of. And during migration, of course, it can be found in virtually any habitat. And most commonly, we see it in home gardens, we see it along roadsides, we see it in meadows, pastures, and other open habitat around where we as Floridians live. And you've probably seen this illustration ad nauseum, but it is good just to kind of recap a little bit about the dynamics of the migration and the populations of monarchs within North America. So to the west of the Rockies, there is the western population, which only a few individuals annually migrate to the mountains of Mexico. The rest of those tend to overwinter along coastal California. And it's a much smaller population in comparison to the large eastern migratory population, which is most well known for, excuse me, its mass annual fall migration down to the high elevation fir forest of Mexico to the west of Mexico City. But as you know, and you can see on this illustration, Florida is a little bit of a unique situation in the fact that we do have a non-migratory population in southeast Florida or southern Florida, and the kind of trajectory of migrating monarchs comes down into the peninsula of Florida and also along the Gulf Coast and the Panhandle. And it is, comparatively to other areas of the migration, relatively poorly studied. So there is still a lot that we are unraveling about the dynamics of this butterfly in the Deep South. And, overall, because it is, obviously, it has a lot of complexity to it, and that complexity changes as urbanization, as climate change, as other stressors and human-caused drivers force that to happen. We, of course, also know over time, and this has been well publicized and potentially maybe over publicized, there has been significant declines in overwintering monarchs, going back, to the early mid 1990s on down to present day. The last overwintering season, 23-24, had really very low numbers of monarchs overwintering in the mountains of Mexico. And so there's been a lot of debate and a lot of friction within the scientific community about the drivers of these declines, the significance of some of these declines, what is actually happening across North America. This is, again, a snapshot of, individual data points through time. But as we all know, insects are highly dynamic. They have boom and bust years. They're dynamic from one season to the next, and there's a lot of potential factors or variables that influence the dynamics of insect population. So indeed, it is complicated, but still this trajectory, if you will, of decline over the last 30 years is worrisome. It's worrisome to biologists, to conservation biologists, and the general public writ large. So that has been the subject of a lot of energy and a lot of effort to kind of help with monarch conservation and the reestablishment of breeding populations, breeding habitat across North America. And of course, this notable decline kind of precipitated a petition for listing of the monarch under the U.S. endangered species list as threatened, and a similar listing in the in Canada as well. So that listing decision is still out there, waiting for additional data and for additional recommendations on how to proceed. But it has again raised a lot of alarm bells for what is actually happening, and how the monarch, as a relatively historically common organism, could kind of be a bellwether for understanding insect decline overall and some of the drivers that affect populations that are much less numerous and much less geographically extensive compared to the monarch. And we also know that the body of research that has been looking into not only monarch decline, but some of the stressors and drivers of that decline is complex. It's ongoing. New research comes out regularly on this topic. There's a lot of large-scale data, community science data, that has helped inform the knowledge that we have about this. But again, it is complicated, and not all scientists are in agreement on the drivers or what actually is happening. Some of the more recent papers have shown that there is, obviously strong indication that monarchs are declining, at least in certain areas of North America. That has remained fairly steady over time. But the drivers of that decline are many and varied, and some recent studies showing in the eastern population that there was strong negative relationships between population size and habitat loss variables. And habitat loss by itself is also complicated, because it's not just essentially conversion of land to urban areas or to agriculture, but it's really loss of breeding habitat. And that includes the wide-scale historic use of glyphosate and Roundup-ready crops that have eliminated a lot of milkweed breeding habitat from agricultural locations, especially in the Great Plains and Midwest, kind of the heart of that monarch breeding area. But there's also increasing evidence that post-2005, that in kind of larger meta studies, that more increasingly evidence of decline has been supported and driven more by climate change than by habitat loss variables. And of course, this is, again, complex. The two interact, and there are many other variables as well. And then there's also been evidence in the Western US that, again, with many variables coming to play, that there is more congruence along the line of land use variables driving decline versus climate change. And so this is clearly an ongoing discussion, and we get better as scientists in unraveling this with more data and more detailed analysis. But this is kind of the current state and the ongoing discussion within the scientific community. There is also, I will say, just like in the public sphere, there's a lot of debate about some of these studies. There's a lot of kind of friction among researchers and others about the interpretation of data and the strength or weaknesses of certain approaches or data types. So again, it's complicated, and we continue through time to add more and more detailed information about this singularly unique organism. And my point of really kind of introducing that is because I really love the quote on this slide. This is from a paper by Cheryl Schultz and others, and this quote says, "Despite being one of the most well-studied insects in the world, many important scientific mysteries of the monarch butterfly remain, particularly regarding processes driving monarch population dynamics, the effectiveness of broad-scale conservation efforts, and related human dimensions in conservation policy." So in clear English, what this says is that even though this is one of the most well-studied insects in the world, we still have a lot of data gaps. We have a lot of information to fill in regarding this, one single organism. So again, it is quite complicated. And we can now drill down a little bit more into Florida, because Florida is kind of uniquely complicated because we are very much a tropical state. We have two populations in Florida historically, a migratory population and a non-migratory resident population. And increasingly, due to climate change and the use of non-native milkweed plants, we have winter breeding increasing in Florida and along the Gulf Coast. So in actuality, we sort of have three different kind of situations of the monarch: migratory, resident, non-migratory, and winter breeding. And so that makes us particularly complicated. And because we are generally out of the main sort of migratory flyway, we've also been a state that has been woefully understudied through time. So there is a lot of vagary of knowledge within Florida. So it's complex, it's challenging, and what I want to do next is kind of present some hopefully some clarity, but also some questions about things that we still don't have good clarity on. So one thing we do know is that the non-resident population in South Florida, again, is woefully understudied. There's very little information on this. When U.S. Fish and Wildlife was sort of developing their baseline assessment for the potential listing of the monarch, there's very little information in the literature and in general knowledge about the status, the extent, the dynamics of this South Florida year-round resident population. We do, however, know that there is connection between the non-migratory population and migratory monarchs, that some do funnel into peninsular Florida, they make their way down to South Florida, some fall out of migration, breed, likely mate with resident monarchs, some continue on to other islands of the Caribbean. So again, it's challenging, it's complex, and we're still woefully understudied when it comes to that particular population in Florida. We also do know, however, that there is a lot more information available thanks to individuals like Lincoln Brower and others about overwintering and the migratory status of monarchs in Florida. There is a long history of extensive knowledge about the return migration to particularly northern peninsular Florida and the Panhandle, and that these individuals, owing to cardinalide signatures, meaning the milkweed signatures upon which the larvae fed upon before migration, link back to milkweeds that do not occur in Florida. So they're more akin to the Midwest and Northeast. So we know that those individuals by far that are coming back to North Florida in the spring, in February, March, and early April, are likely from the overwintering grounds in Mexico, because their larvae fed upon milkweeds that do not typically occur in Florida. And thanks to Lincoln Brower, kind of a sentinel individual in monarch research, he had the foresight over 30 years ago to initiate a long-term return migration study in North Florida and at a private property large ranch site in Cross Creek, Florida, just south of Gainesville. And he monitored that site for 20 some years, and then my lab inherited that project, and we continue to monitor that site on an annual basis. And so it has provided a deep wealth of data and knowledge spanning over 30 years of time about the return migration. And so for the return migration of monarchs coming into North Florida from the overwintering grounds in Mexico, most of them rely heavily on only a few species of milkweed, because these are early season milkweeds that are vegetative when monarchs are returning to North Florida. And one of the most important ones is this milkweed. This is sandhill milkweed or pinewoods milkweed, Asclepias humistrata. And at this site, we monitor not only the butterflies coming back, the eggs and larvae on the plants, but also the plant phenology. So we go out and we code the growth of these plants in this large site so we can understand how the phenology and the return of the migration kind of dovetail together, and whether this has changed over time due to climate change. And so you can kind of see the overall stages from the plant emerging from the ground, developing flower buds, blooming, setting pods, the seed dispersal, and plants senescing by early summer. So these plants are, at this time of the year, especially in a warm year like this year, are beginning to senesce already. So this is a very ephemeral spring plant, but it's readily available when monarchs are coming back into Florida, and is really a key plant for the return migration into the southern coastal plain. And this graph here just shows essentially kind of the overall phenology of this plant. So you can see that individuals start emerging from the ground in late February, early March. By sort of mid-April or so, they are sort of in peak bloom. And then by the middle of May or early May, they are essentially done blooming. They've set their seeds and plants are beginning to senesce. So this phenology has been relatively remarkably stable over the last 30 years, even with increasing temperatures in Florida. And the number of individuals coming back to Florida has also stayed fairly constant from a phenology point of view. So you can see here that adults start returning in early March. They sort of reach a peak between early April and early May. And then those individuals, that first generation is essentially done, and they're dispersing, looking northward and other areas to find additional milkweeds as they kind of disperse and repopulate much of the eastern seaboard each year. But one thing that has come up in these in this study and the data that we've collected is that kind of mirroring those declines in the overwintering grounds, we have seen similar declines with return migration rates into North Florida, both adults and also the number of eggs and larvae present on plants going back to the mid-1990s and almost to present day. So you can see a fairly steep decline. This translates to about an 80% or so decline over the same time period as that Monarch watch graph that I showed earlier, showing the overwintering grounds in Mexico and the numbers of overwintering monarchs. So there is clear connection between the declines happening in overwintering grounds and those returning to Florida. Again, declining by almost 80%. And this is both the abundance of adults and the density of eggs over time. It's correlated significantly, indicated that these declines are indeed interconnected. And it's very reasonable to hypothesize that the dwindling numbers of overwintering monarchs in Mexico is obviously contributing to the dwindling numbers of monarchs that are found and are recolonizing North Florida each year. So we do know that this has again stayed relatively consistent over time with the timing of recolonization, but the numbers have fallen off dramatically over the same period of years. So now we can transition a little into some of the other issues related to the monarch, the protozoan parasite, Ophrocystis electroscura, and also the use of non-native milkweed such as Asclepias curasavica or tropical or Mexican milkweed. So for a little bit of background, and again, I'm not a pathologist, an insect pathologist. I'm an ecologist, and so this is not my primary area of research, but there is a lot of information in the literature on this particular impact to monarchs. It is a protozoan parasite. It does begin its life cycle as spores that are ingested by the caterpillar while it's feeding on milkweed. It multiplies within the larva, and then during the last few days of the pupal stage, it produces new spores that ultimately make their way onto the adult butterfly once it closes from the pupa and is passed on into the environment. We'll talk a little bit about the modes of transmission as well. But this is ubiquitous in all Danaine butterflies, monarchs, queens, soldiers, other tropical Danaine subfamily butterflies. And so it has a background throughout, all these species, including the monarch. But we do know that at kind of high levels or outbreak levels, it can directly impact survival of the monarch, meaning lead to direct mortality. And it can also affect the fitness of the butterfly. So they are less fit overall for both migration and also for survival within local populations. So it is a threat to the monarch. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the dynamics and some of the other interactions with this protozoan parasite. Regarding ways of transmission, there are two primary ways of transmission. One is vertical, and that's when an infected female sheds spores onto her eggs and the surrounding leaves as she lays an egg on milkweed. So the spores directly come off her body onto the egg and the surrounding plant. And then once her larva hatches from that egg, it ingests those spores and therefore becomes infected. And so it becomes a cycle of infection overall. The second mode of transmission is environmental, and this is when infected adults scatter the spores onto a milkweed and an unrelated caterpillar or larva ingests that. So it's not mother to offspring, it's unrelated offspring being infected due to spores being on that plant from a previous female butterfly laying eggs. And there is also evidence that OE can be transferred although probably not in a significant manner from a male to a healthy female during mating. But vertical and environmental transmission are the two most common ways that this protozoan parasite is transmitted from one organism to another and infects populations. We also do know increasingly there is a growing body of research on the impact of climate change, especially warming temperatures on monarchs, on its population dynamics, and also on the impact of OE. So this is a really nice, relatively recent study that showed that both warming temperatures affect both monarchs as well as their OE parasites, that under increasing heat, both the host and the parasite performance decreases. So it causes lower survival, smaller adult size in monarchs, and also decrease performance of the OE parasite. And we can expect that this dynamic will only increase under climate change scenarios. And of course, in Florida, we're kind of at the climate change epicenter with increasing temperatures. And for those of you that remember last summer, it was an incredibly hot year. We hope that this year will not be incredibly hot as much as last year, but it's starting out pretty warm as well. So there are going to be increasing impacts of a warming planet on both the monarch, its fitness, and also the dynamics with this OE parasite. We also can expect that under warming climate, that there'll be further shifts of migratory monarchs to resident monarchs or winter breeding monarchs because of warming temperatures. And this will likely favor increased transmission and population level impacts of OE parasites because more and more individuals will breed for extended periods of time, meaning those OE spores and infection rates will build up in local populations more than they have in the past. And this presents increasing dangers to the monarch as we proceed under a warming climate. So now we get to another culprit, and that is tropical milkweed. And so you're all very familiar with this plant. It is arguably the most commercially available milkweed on the market. It's ubiquitous at big box stores, at most specialty nurseries. It is a tropical plant. It grows like a weed, and it does not senesce like other milkweed. So it doesn't die back at a point during the season. And that is what potentially causes a lot of the problem with this plant. It is also very easy to grow, as I mentioned. So it's truly a brown thumb plant. It's a milkweed. It grows like a weed. It's incredibly easy to propagate. That's why growers love it. That's why a lot of homeowners and gardeners love it because it is so easy and reliable to grow. And it is also, we have to keep in mind that this plant is a commercial ornamental, and it is often used in the landscape simply as an ornamental, regardless of any kind of potential planting for the monarch or any other milkweed butterflies. So it is, at its core, it's a non-native ornamental in the landscape trade. And it is often periodically mislabeled as a native. If any of you go to big box stores or other nurseries, I have seen this plant labeled as Asclepias incarnata, butterfly weed, other milkweed, native milkweed plants. So it creates a lot of uncertainty, a lot of misinformation within the general public that makes kind of dealing with the problem of tropical milkweed, OE, and monarch conservation even more complex and challenging. So one of the possible issues with tropical milkweed use is that it can increase OE infection, transmission, and local population impacts. We know that it can disrupt fall migration. We know that it technically increases the likelihood of winter breeding. It increases likelihood of death due to inclement weather because you have monarchs in your landscape in areas that receive frost or freeze events during the middle of the winter where historically there were no monarchs around. There is dangers of acute and sublethal insecticide impacts. There's dangers regarding negative aphid-monarch interactions. And again, just the misconception that it is often mislabeled as a native. So we will kind of dissect this slide a little more kind of in order of some of the potential issues with OE and this plant. So starting with OE and winter breeding monarchs, there's been kind of good research out there by Sonia Altizer and many others showing that in certain areas where winter breeding monarchs occur, the OE levels of infection can be up to 9 times higher than in non-breeding overwintering monarchs. So it creates a challenge. We know that in these areas where winter breeding takes place, OE can build up, but that is still a complex situation. And because of these high infection rates, at least locally, as I mentioned before, it creates two primary challenges to the monarch. One is that monarchs can become heavily infected with OE, may actually die outright because of the heavy parasite load. And the second is that kind of a fitness level effect that even though they don't die immediately, they are shown to have reduced fitness, reduced size, they don't live as long, they can't migrate as well, and they can also spread this more effectively to others within the population. So clearly this plant can proliferate the infection of OE and can proliferate winter breeding more regularly. We also know, of course, that across all milkweeds, and we have 21 native milkweeds in Florida, and of course, this non-native, we also have several other milkweed family plants that are commercially available. We know that cardenolide levels across all these plants vary considerably. It is an inducible offense, so that also increases with feeding damage on the plant. But if you look at that little kind of chart or graph on the upper right-hand side, you will see in the upper center Asclepias curassavica. So Asclepias curassavica has very high cardenolide levels. And so there is also evidence that monarchs will seek out, infected monarchs will seek out Asclepias curassavica to sort of self-medicate. And there is evidence showing that monarchs that are infected with OE that are feeding on Asclepias curassavica have less effects of the OE parasite than those that are feeding on milkweeds that have lower cardenolide levels. So again, there's interaction with the host, with the cardenolide levels, with the parasite. There's also evidence that there's interaction with fungus in the root system. So again, it's a very complex host plant parasite interaction. And then that gets me to this slide. So this is a complex slide, and I apologize, I don't mean for it to be overly complex, but I wanted to get across a couple of ideas in this slide. So first and foremost, there is a lot of worry about the use of tropical milkweed for monarch conservation, especially in highly urbanized areas. And the reason for that is these are more fragmented landscapes and highly urbanized landscapes, meaning that the concentration of tropical milkweed in those areas can often be high, but across the landscape as a whole, they are in sort of hotbed pockets throughout that landscape. And so, in other words, that can concentrate the OE infection to sort of outbreak levels at a very local, sort of um, highly situational, localized rate compared to less fragmented, less urbanized landscapes where milkweeds sort of predominate broadly across the landscape. And so the risk of OE infection is spread across many milkweeds, many different species of milkweeds, a broad landscape level effect where one little core within that population or landscape is unlikely to have sort of outbreak levels of OE. So that is one challenge or one worry with the use of tropical milkweed in urbanized landscapes, is that we can artificially create hotbed areas where OE infection is particularly high or at outbreak levels, and therefore increase significantly the transmission of OE in these hotbed areas, basically drawing monarchs to these areas where the general outcome is they are going to get infected by OE. So that is one possible scenario, and that's one worry within kind of the broad level of research regarding OE and the use of non-native tropical milkweed. I will say, however, that in sort of pushing back on planting milkweed more broadly, we look at including native milkweeds in the landscape and planting native milkweeds across all the areas that we live within the built environment, within our yards and neighborhoods, roadsides, easements, agricultural land, parks and green space, conservation lands, that'll essentially increase the availability of host, arguably, but it'll also decrease the site-specific infection rate of OE because it's essentially a dilution effect. As more milkweeds are available in the landscape, OE doesn't have those sort of hotbed areas where it comes concentrated within the landscape. So essentially, the more milkweed spread broadly across the landscape, OE levels should go down. And this is also tempered with the fact that over a fairly large spatial scale and temporal scale, meaning allow these milkweeds to nest, there's seasonality, there's weather effects, there's predatory effects of other organisms, there's other parasitoids that are affecting the monarch. This is a very complex dynamic, and it's very akin to sort of pest plant interactions that you might have in an agricultural setting. So as an example, if you occupy or run a greenhouse with a singular crop, let's say tomato, you're more likely to have outbreaks of whitefly within that greenhouse setting because you have all of your plants concentrated. You don't have a very dynamic environment for that pest and any potential natural enemy to occupy. However, you grow that in a very large area that is dynamic, dispersed, diversified. That dynamic is going to be very complex, and you're unlikely to have outbreak levels of a pest happen at that sort of landscape scale and highly diverse scale. So the same thing happens with OE in this sort of broad dynamic of monarchs dispersing, a lot of milkweeds across the landscape, a lot of different variables affecting the population dynamics. You would expect to see that OE levels would not reach outbreak levels very often. So that is more the natural state that you would likely assume to happen across a broader landscape with a lot of milkweeds being available. So I hope that in some respects that was clear. I apologize if it was a little bit complex, but I'm just basically trying to emphasize that one of the dangers of concentrating non-native milkweeds in an urbanized setting is that we can artificially build up these hotbed areas for OE. And so arguably, we would want to diversify the landscape. We want to get more milkweeds across the landscape. We certainly want to continue to plant native milkweeds when possible, and we have to be aware of some of the dangers of OE and non-native milkweed when we plant it in highly urbanized or highly fragmented settings. So next, another danger of tropical milkweed is the fact that it increases the likelihood of winter breeding in monarchs. And this is from a paper that was recently published, and I love the diagram because it makes it fairly simple. And this builds upon work by Sonia Altizer and others showing that when migratory monarchs given exposure to both native milkweed and non-native tropical milkweed, if they encounter native milkweed when they're migrating, they're more likely to fall out of migration, become reproductively active again, and lay eggs on tropical milkweed. So in many ways, tropical milkweed can help to disrupt the migration. It can cause winter breeding at times of the year that are not optimal for the monarch. We all certainly want monarchs in our landscape, but we have to be mindful of what is best at the organism level, not what is best for us. And so in the typical state with a native milkweed, that plant is going to die back. It's going to be dormant during the winter months. There is not going to be any winter breeding available to the monarch, or any winter breeding opportunity available to monarch. However, with the non-native tropical milkweed, because that plant does not die back, it does not senesce, it's vegetative year-round. So if monarchs encounter that plant when they migrate, they're more likely to fall out of migration, to breed, and they're going to be breeding at times of year that are not optimal. So, yes, it's wonderful to have monarchs in your yard in December or January, but that is not the historic state. And what happens typically is, we all know along the Gulf Coast, there will be a freeze or frost event, at least one during the winter. And so what happens if you have monarch larvae on your tropical milkweed plant in Gainesville and we have a hard freeze? Well, that plant is going to die back. Your larvae are going to die. It's a dead end for the monarch. It's essentially a trap for the monarch. So we want to avoid those negative impacts on both the migration and on the organism and the population level effects that tropical milkweed can have on the monarch. So again, think about what is best for the monarch. Monarchs should be migrating through in North Florida. They should not be breeding during the winter months, because historically there were no or very limited resources available for them to do so. And from that same paper, and I can send this to Wendy, I can send a little bibliography of additional papers if any of you are interested in reading them. But this is a really great kind of table outlining additional questions about winter breeding behavior in the monarch, and some approaches to be able to answer them. And it gets back to my point that we still have a lot to learn. We do not have all the information. There are a lot of questions still hanging out there regarding how this dynamic of winter breeding is being driven. What are the impacts to the monarch? How do we address it? And can some of these winter breeding populations actually do harm or even potentially rescue migratory populations over time? So there are a lot of outstanding questions regarding the impact of winter breeding, especially along the southern tier of states. One additional threat that I think is particularly insidious when it comes to tropical milkweed, that does not get as much attention, in my opinion, as it deserves, and that is the use of pesticides during production of this plant. And historically, if you went to a big box store, you would probably have seen a little plant tag like the one on the right-hand side of the slide that said this plant is protected from problematic aphids, whiteflies, beetles, and mealybugs, and other unwanted pests by neonicotinoids. Well, a lot of growers have eliminated the use of neonicotinoids, and that is indeed a positive, but they have simply replaced those chemicals with other systemic pesticides. These are chemicals that are taken up in the tissues of the plant, and they provide very good control for soft-bodied insect pests on plants during production, but of course they can be quite lethal to the monarch. And so it becomes an issue where many of these plants grown commercially are treated. They can have very insidious effects on impacting monarch health and monarch survival. And since we don't know exactly the concentration that was applied, we don't know necessarily which chemicals were applied, we have a very poor understanding of how long they will reside in active form within the plant, and how long your plants will be essentially let's say, dangerous to monarchs, and when they will actually become safe to feed upon by monarch larvae. And we mean the collective we of myself, my lab, and and Adam Dale's lab at the University of Florida, have increasingly worked on insecticide trials with both a foliar pests such as oleander aphid and monarch larvae to understand the effect of some of these insecticides, primarily systemic insecticides, on both aphid control and monarch mortality. And so this slide, I don't want to go into any detail, but these are essentially different insecticides along with insecticidal soap. And the little orange line shows essentially how this chemical is used to suppress aphid control on these plants over time. And when sort of that control wanes, basically the longevity of this chemical for aphid control. And you can see there's quite a bit of variability. And that kind of green bar along the bottom, that's kind of our threshold at which we consider aphid levels to be acceptable. So you can see that it varies from one chemical to another, that some are very good at knocking down populations, but they often rebound quite quickly. Some have prolonged level effects up to 4 weeks. Others have much shorter level effects on aphids. But what is even more worrisome is that when you look at the impact of chronic mortality, meaning kind of immediate mortality on the monarch, you see that in many ways, aphid control and monarch mortality do not directly align. So in many ways, aphid control is less sensitive than monarch mortality. So these chemicals are actually having more impact on monarch mortality than they are essentially on aphid control. So monarchs growing on these plants can actually be more sensitive to some of these insecticides through time. So this creates a challenge for these plants to be produced commercially. It creates a challenge for home care to deal with pest outbreaks on your plants. So again, it's complicated, and in many ways, this is kind of hanging out there as a real serious impact of using a commercially grown milkweed like tropical milkweed, that this could really be a significant ecological sink for the monarch if this plant is treated with insecticides and then widely used for some period of time in urban landscapes. So be mindful of where you buy your plants from. Be mindful that even some native milkweeds are produced commercially and can be used, and a variety of insecticides can be used during production. So it is a complex landscape out there when it comes to plant production and the interaction between control and monarch mortality. So in summary of that kind of level effect is that planting milkweed may avoid some of the negative effects of the insecticides that are used for aphid control. Some of these are indeed highly selective, but they still often are toxic for an extended period of time that can affect monarch health, monarch fitness, or monarch mortality. And frequent applications of something less toxic like insecticidal soap, they may work for a home gardener, but it's certainly not going to work for a commercial grower. And so we have to continuously look at ways in which growers can mitigate the negative effects on the monarch and still render some level of pest control for this plant if indeed this plant continues on the market. And then one additional topic that we also investigated, and that is kind of the bane of many people growing milkweeds, especially tropical milkweed, is that oftentimes your plants at home look like the picture on the left here. They're significantly impacted by aphids. And what we know about this interaction now is that milkweeds infected with oleander aphids can actually cause direct impacts to the monarch. They can cause less fit individuals to be produced over time, smaller individuals, longer developmental periods, which make them more susceptible to loss due to other predation. They can also cause direct mortality because of potentially increase of cardenolide levels as an inducible defense in these plants. So there is actually a direct interaction between aphids on the plants and monarch health on tropical milkweed as well. So not only do females lay less eggs on infected plants, but they also perform much more poorly on heavily aphid infested plants through time. So again, a lot of impacts overall. So I'm going to end because I know I'm going kind of long on this presentation and I want to leave time for questions, but recommendations for going into the future, and that is we should, where at all possible, plant native milkweeds. Florida has over 21 species of milkweed. I know not all of these are available. I know it's often hard to find native milkweed, but we should avoid tropical milkweed whenever we can. But we do have to understand this as a widely utilized plant. It's not going anywhere tomorrow in the green industry. So if we do use it, we have to be mindful of those impacts that I went over in the previous slides. And so my general recommendations are, if you live north of Lake Okeechobee and you do use tropical milkweed, cut it back to the ground in October, force it to be non-vegetative until late February. At least that'll knock down some of the impacts of OE building up and the impact to disrupting the monarch migration and winter breeding. Avoid pesticide-treated plants as much as possible. And certainly don't rear monarchs indoors. There's a lot of reason we shouldn't be mass rearing monarchs. I won't go into all these, but there's good evidence that those individuals that are reared indoors do not behave well back in the wild for orientation, for migration. It is more likely to transmit disease in highly crowded environments, much more likely to produce less fit individuals. So enjoy monarchs in the wild. Don't rear them in large quantities indoors. Accept Mother Nature as she is, that some monarchs are going to be lost in your yard. That's just Mother Nature being Mother Nature. And so try to keep the organism best interest in mind as you move forward. And with that, I'll say thank you and be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Jared, thank you so much. Lots of food for thought. So I'm gonna give you some good questions. And I think we'll start off with some ones that I believe you presented some data on. Are all native milkweeds equally beneficial? Also, have you studied the nectar plants as far as transmitting the OE?
So monarchs certainly have some preferences, and I would say of there's a kind of a shorter list of native milkweeds in Florida that are particularly useful to the monarch, and I'm going to land on a few that are more commercially available through the native plant trade, and those are Asclepias incarnata, swamp milkweed, aquatic milkweed, Asclepias perennis, um, um, Asclepias humistrata, as I mentioned, although that's not necessarily commercially available. A lot of these can be grown by seed, and increasingly the native plant growers are trying to get more natives into the market. In general, Monarch can use a lot of native milkweeds across Florida. They do use most of the native milkweeds, but they do have preferences as well.
Okay. Okay, and then there are other milkweed relatives that people are using in the landscape now, like Calotropis gigantea and the a couple of the other relatives. Could you speak to that? Someone is saying that they don't host OE, and I'm not quite sure that I know about that.
Yeah, so there are, swan milkweed and giant milkweed are increasingly available commercially as ornamentals and are widely used, throughout much of peninsular Florida and even outside. They have some of the same issues that tropical milkweed. They're tropical plants. They don't die back. Um, we don't have a lot of, at least I'm not aware of a lot of data on those plants as far as impact to monarchs, but I think we should assume that um, a lot of the same dangers that tropical milkweed presents to the monarch, these other plants also present because they're non-native, they don't die back, um, they promote long-standing monarch populations available. So again, I would argue always to use native milkweed first as a foremost. Again, some of these are highly ornamental. Giant milkweed is incredibly unique in the landscape. It's grown widely and used widely. But I think the jury is still out on exactly how some of these other plants affect the monarch. But I think we should assume the model of tropical milkweed and say that these plants that have similar sort of phenologies and life histories affect the monarch in very similar ways.
Okay. Someone asked if native milkweed senesces, what does the non-migrating monarch eat during the winter?
So
Um,
it does, most native milkweeds do senesce. Um, Certainly in South Florida, I think all bets are off for natural senescence of a lot of native milkweeds historically, and now right now tropical milkweed is widely escaped into natural areas in South Florida. It's widely available. I do know like species like aquatic milkweed, Asclepias perennis. Um, if you go into kind of coastal areas or wetland areas where that plant does occur, there is some good evidence that that plant doesn't naturally die back every winter unless it really gets extremely cold in Florida. So some of those can theoretically be vegetative during the winter, but I think they're highly unlikely to be utilized for winter breeding by the monarch, and that has been shown by that very nice, elegant study that Sonia Altizer did exposing migratory monarchs to native and tropical milkweed, that they're much less likely to fall out of migration when exposed to native milkweeds versus non-native milkweeds.
okay. So you had talked a little bit about the density of milkweed in the landscape. And so Stephanie is asking, is it better to plant then more of a diffuse population of milkweed as opposed to a concentrated butterfly garden?
Um, so when I showed that slide, I meant a couple of I wanted a couple of points to come across. One is that non-native milkweed in an urbanized setting uh, can lead to increased OE for a couple of reasons. One is that we're really concentrating those plants in one area, and second, because that plant doesn't die back, it doesn't senesce. So that's kind of an added negative or potential challenge. If you're using native milkweeds, I don't think that that is really an issue. And my other point was there was some chatter about not planting any milkweeds at all in Florida or removing milkweeds, and I wanted to emphasize that that should not be the mode. That I disagree with that statement, and I think most ecologists would, that increasing native plants more broadly across all landscapes is a net positive for wildlife for so many other reasons. There's a lot of other organisms that use milkweed, and it also provides great opportunity for people to connect and reconnect with nature. So there's so many positives on that side and very few negatives. And the more milkweeds broadly across the landscape will sort of diffuse or dilute the infection of OE in theory. And so because of the kind of escape in time and space and the complexity of those relationships. In urbanized settings, like I said, the worry is that tropical milkweed will kind of create these hotbed areas where you're having long-standing breeding populations and high OE infection rates. And so I would again argue that even in urbanized settings, use native milkweed over tropical milkweed whenever possible.
Okay, and then, Jaret, there's a few more questions about the tropical milkweed. So what about the cutting back?
Yeah, I mean, and so there's not a lot of evidence. There's not a lot of good data on this, but you know, uh, I just wanted to emphasize that this plant, unfortunately, is not going anywhere tomorrow, right? It's widely used. It's incredibly um, widespread commercially. The green industry is not going to eliminate this at any time in the near future. So we have to be aware that this plant is going to continue to be widely used. And so if you do use it for any number of reasons, you can't find native, you like the plant, whatever the case is, we just want to try to minimize the negative impact. So one potential way to do that is to force the plant to die back. Essentially, cut it down in October. Don't let it be available to migrating monarchs to encounter that plant, especially north of Lake Okeechobee. And in theory, that will sort of uh, kind of reduce the OE infection rate because you're kind of forcing those that kind of infection to die down, and you're less likely to impact migrating monarchs by not having that plant available to encounter as they're migrating, and therefore not fall out of migration and not having any plant available for winter breeding. And so it's a recommendation, and we still have to look into a lot of the data on it. But that's really, with the current base of knowledge, that's the best recommendation I can provide.
Okay. Um, let's see, what about south of Lake Okeechobee? Should they be chopping the milkweed back?
Yeah, so I mean, again, this is an arbitrary line, but South Florida is such a different system than the rest of Florida. And we know that many of the monarchs, most of the monarchs in South Florida are disconnected from the migration. So they're winter breeding, they're resident. I think that there's no real negative impact to the larger populations of monarchs in South Florida by having tropical milkweed available, by having um, other milkweed available year-round in South Florida. It's just a different situation. But anywhere where we know that monarchs are physically migrating and encountering plants in sort of North Florida, we want to minimize that disturbance. So it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but we just don't know a lot about that South Florida dynamic. And because it is, pretty disconnected or entirely disconnected from the migration, I think there's very little danger, if any, to migrating monarchs by having, by using this plant or having winter breeding in South Florida. With the caveat that, again, pesticide use is still an impact, right? We still want to minimize, we don't want to plant a plant that's going to kill monarchs. And so we should still be mindful of doing our due diligence, selecting the right plants if possible, selecting natives, selecting untreated plants, but it's complex and it's often impossible to do so.
Okay. And then about the Asclepias curvasca being an invasive, I just checked on the IFAS assessment. They say it's a caution plant for South Florida. How is the naturalization going down there? Someone said, would you support it being on a invasive list or the noxious plant list?
I mean that determination, I mean there's good kind of metrics for making that determination. All I was trying to say is that plant, I clearly see that plant escaped into the wild in South Florida. It is, in a lot of areas of conservation, a lot of wildlands, roadsides, other areas. So it has escaped cultivation and is available in non-ornamental garden locations in South Florida. Whether it's should be listed, it is not up to me.
Okay. And then I have a question that you have recommended planting more native milkweed to reduce OE infection. How would you expect this to reduce infection rates currently in the 90% range? And what data are you basing that on?
So that's a general statement, and what I mean by that, I was kind of pushing back on the removal of all milkweeds, and that it if you look at sort of dynamics of predator, prey, weather, parasitoids across a very dynamic landscape with a lot of host material available, there's going to be a lot of cycling through kind of outbreak levels to non-outbreak levels. There's going to be a lot of other variables coming to bear that are going to impact monarch population dynamics. And what we want to try to avoid is these hotbed or hotspot areas where OE can build up. And so the more milkweeds more broadly across the landscape will sort of dilute the infection rate across that entire landscape in theory. And so that's my argument there. And I think that's borne out well with predator-prey interaction level research in agriculture and in other dynamics for pest host, pest prey interactions, that these dynamic environments where there are a lot of other factors and a lot of variables coming to bear, you just don't have those outbreak levels compared to sort of very artificial settings like greenhouse settings or indoor settings where you have a house plant that doesn't have natural enemies and you have whitefly or outbreaks or other pest outbreaks.
Okay. And is there any way to tell if the current infection spread that we're having in Florida, if the current infection in Florida is being spread into the North American migration?
So I mean, that's another area of research that I think, as winter breeding continues to expand, the impact of OE levels building up and how that gets transmitted and the effect to other populations or other areas where um, other local populations, it needs to be further researched. I think clearly that the bulk of the North American breeding of monarchs still takes place in the Northeast and Midwest. Those are areas that clearly are not going to be affected by climate variables to the fact that they will not have overwintering or non-migratory individuals. We're just talking about sort of the southern tier of states that increasingly, because of warming climate and tropical milkweed or other non-native milkweeds, have a higher propensity of winter breeding, and that is increasing. So we still don't have a lot of data on this, and so I think it still has to be an area for future research because we don't have all the answers right now.
Okay. And if you suspect you have an OE problem in your milkweed stand, what would you recommend doing?
I would sort of recommend kind of culling your monarchs, kind of cutting back the plant to sort of break that cycle of OE if possible. That may be effective. It may not be fully effective, but it certainly theoretically will help break the cycle of OE. And I know that's a hard thing for people to do, but again, we should be mindful that our goal as gardeners and kind of nature backers is to do the best for the system and the organism, not necessarily what we want all the time. And so we have to be mindful of what is best for the monarch. And so, I would strongly recommend also, participating in the University of Georgia's Monarch Health um, citizen science projects to monitor OE, to provide data to scientists. But if you suspect impact, then I think, taking some action on that is probably worthwhile. I think it's probably a sound recommendation.
Okay. And Jared, I mean, we are suggesting that people grow the native milkweed, right? But it seems so difficult to do in that residential setting. Do you have any tips or, recommended species that seem to do the best? I
Yeah,
have,
I
I've
think it's,
struggled myself.
I know.
I've given up in Gainesville.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I grow two species in my yard, Asclepias perennis and Asclepias incarnata, and a little bit of tuberosa at times. Tuberosa is very hard because it's very finicky on the soil type that it likes, but perennis and incarnata often do quite well in the landscape. They also do quite well in container plantings,
Okay.
where you can really control the soil and you control the moisture levels. And I found that to be very effective. Those are also three of the most commonly available milkweeds, at least in the native plant trade. Perennis and incarnata are not difficult to grow from seed either, so they can easily be grown from seed or by cuttings. There's no good solution to this, I don't think. But I will also remind folks that I can still remember, I'm old enough to remember that, 20 years ago when um, I first came down to the deep south, actually longer than that, but at least 20 years ago or so, big box stores such as Lowe's and Home Depot were actively selling incarnata and perennis. And I think the main reason that they stopped selling those plants is because tropical milkweed became easier to grow, but secondarily they went to that 1 year plant guarantee. Whereas if your plant dies, you bring it back, you get a refund or replacement plant. Well, what do native milkweeds do? They die back, they senesce. And so it becomes a misinformation campaign. The public didn't understand that that is the normal life cycle of my plant. It dies back, it's not dead. It will come back the following year, but they assumed it was dead. And I think that drove the market for a highly reliable, easy to grow, and arguably incredibly efficient and cheap plant to grow, which is Asclepias curasavica. So it can be grown in large commercial settings, and hopefully at some point in time it will return to that situation. Um, and like I mentioned, I don't think tropical milkweed is going anywhere overnight. It's clearly widespread and ornamental. It's very profitable. I think, we can help drive that by going to especially smaller nurseries and demanding native milkweed. It's a little bit of the chicken and the egg, and even native plant growers and the Florida Association of Native Nurseries recognize this, that oftentimes their growers don't feel that there's an adequate market for native milkweed, but clearly we know there is, and so it becomes the chicken and the egg. They don't grow it because they don't think there's a market. People can't plant it because there's not availability of it. So we should demand native milkweed be available when we go to nurseries, and slowly over surely over time we can change that paradigm and kind of steer the Queen Mary in a different direction, hopefully. And more information is being generated on the propagation techniques for a lot of these native milkweed species, not only for commercial production, but also for restoration. So we're getting better at understanding how to grow these plants in sort of larger settings as well. So I think things will change over time, but it will be slow.
Okay. Okay. So there's this question about cutting back and removing does that actually help knock back the OE population? And then, if I understood you, Jaret, you were like, you're not for banning tropical milkweed because you feel like it's just with us now and we're not going to be able to do that much about it. But as active master gardeners and people who educate others, we would always recommend native milkweed over tropical milkweed at any opportunity, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, we should uh, promote native milkweed and promote its use, promote its availability. But like you mentioned, there are many situations where the public can't find native milkweed. They can't. There's not a grower near them. There's not a native plant sale nearby. They just can't grow. They can't find it, or they can't. They don't have success growing it. And so, um, I'm going to push back a little on sort of some of the criticism more broadly, that I do think the attention that the Monarch has generated is a significant net benefit for environmental conservation, pollinator conservation. It provides an opportunity for people to connect with a highly charismatic organism and be turned on to doing things positive in their neighborhoods, in their home landscape, in their neighboring parks and conservation areas. So there is that broad benefit of connecting people to the organism, but we just have to be mindful that there are a lot of dangers to using that plant. And so it's kind of with some trepidation that we use it, and I think it has some utility. We just need to be mindful that we're trying to do the best we can for the monarch. And that is number one, plant native milkweed. But if we can't, what else can we do? And I think one other thing that we can do, even if we don't plant milkweed at all, is we can plant a lot of blooming resources for monarchs when they're migrating. There's good evidence that lack of floral resources during migration is a stressor for monarchs as well. So whether it be actively becoming involved in trying to promote wildflower plantings along roadsides, restoring land, planting wildflower meadows in your yard or neighborhood, I think this is going to writ large benefit a wide range of insects, including the monarch. Even if we can't have monarch larvae in a yard, we can still do things that will help the butterfly and many other forms of wildlife as well. So, we all have a role to play. We can all do something positive.
Right. Well, with that, Jared, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up as we're about 15 minutes over what I requested your time for. I know that you said that you would provide a brief bibliography, and what I'm hearing is that people would also like that to include recommendations for native
Okay.
milkweeds for Florida. So I know we have that information as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for educating us and kind of getting us a lot more information about this situation so we can make our own choices in our own landscapes and educate about that as well.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you all for participating. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to working with all of you. And keep in mind it's a complex topic, but we want to do the best for the monarch and for other wildlife as well.
Great. And Jaret will be at the Master Gardener Conference. It's happening in October. So he's doing a general session, and then he's also doing a more drilled down concurrent session. So that would be an excellent time to hear more about this as it evolves. So Jaret, thank you again, and we will see you sooner than later. Thank you, Jaret.
Thanks, Wendy. Thank you.